The North Atlantic in early 1944 was no longer the hunting ground it had once been. For the U-boats of Admiral Dönitz' Kriegsmarine, the war beneath the waves had turned from a predator's game into a gauntlet of death. The sky, once their refuge, had become their executioner. Radar, lee lights, and the ceaseless hum of Allied patrol aircraft now ruled the ocean's surface. Even a moment spent recharging batteries could invite annihilation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On a gray morning in March, a cold wind swept across the Bay of Biscay, a vast stretch of steel-gray water between France and Spain that had become the graveyard of U-boats. Beneath the wind's rasp and the rhythmic pulse of diesel engines, U-976 moved cautiously at periscope depth. Her commander, Kapitän-Leutnant Wilhelm Zahn, a 31-year-old veteran of the North Atlantic, knew this crossing could decide his crew's fate. His orders were simple but perilous. Transit west toward deeper waters, avoid Allied patrols, and resume convoy hunting off Ireland's coast. Zahn's U-boat carried scars from earlier patrols, patchwork welds along her pressure hull, a cracked gauge in the control room, and a periscope lens that never quite cleared right. But the greater wound was psychological. In the officers' mess at Lorient before departure, men whispered about the phantom planes, fast, twin-engined, impossible to hear before they struck. Some claimed they were American. Others swore they were British Mosquitoes, armed with a cannon large enough to sink a ship. None of them had lived long enough to confirm the rumors. Above them, the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command was perfecting its own form of surgical warfare. At RAF Britannic in Cornwall, the pilots of No. 248 Squadron gathered before dawn. The briefing officer's pointer tapped the Bay of Biscay on a wall map, a red circle drawn roughly 80 miles northwest of Brest. He said, "Signals intercept picked up a U-boat transmission at 0437 hours, likely outbound. Orders are to intercept and engage. 2 Tetsis will lead the patrol." The word hung in the air. Tetsi, the code name for one of the most unusual aircraft of the war, the Havilland Mosquito FB Mk.XVIII, fitted with a 57mm Collins cannon. To most of the men, the Mosquito was already a legend, the wooden wonder, built from plywood yet faster than most fighters. But the Tetsi was something else entirely. Its nose, once fitted for machine guns, now carried a naval gun adapted for aerial use. The Molins cannon could fire 6-pound shells at the rate of 1 every half second, each capable of punching through a submarine's hull from over a mile away. Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips, age 24, ran a gloved hand across his aircraft's olive-green fuselage. The cannon's muzzle protruded beneath the nose like a spear. He had flown Beaufighters and Blenheims before this, but nothing like the Tetsi. He called it a sledgehammer with wings. His navigator, Jack Turner, climbed aboard beside him, checking the radar set, a compact unit capable of detecting surface submarines even in fog. The engines ignited with a roar that rolled across the tarmac, blending with the Atlantic wind. 2 Mosquitoes lifted into the gray sky, their propellers carving faint spirals in the mist. Far below, Zahn gave the order to surface. The deck hatch opened with a hiss. Men emerged into the cold air, blinking at the overcast dawn. They needed to run the diesels, recharge, and send a brief signal home. The radio man tapped his key, transmitting a burst of encrypted Morse to Lorient. It lasted only 20 seconds, long enough for Allied direction finders to fix his position. In a distant operations hut at Predannick, a young WAAF pilot marked the bearing on her chart and called out, "Possible contact, grid square 47C." Phillips' radio crackled. "Mosquito Red 2, we have an intercept for you. Course 087, distance 80 miles. He looked at Turner. "Let's see if we can find our shadow." The Tetsi dipped its nose and accelerated eastward, engines howling. Somewhere ahead, on the cold Atlantic, Zahn's U-boat rode the surface, unaware that the hunters had already found his trail. The countdown to 19 seconds had quietly begun. Before it ever fired a shot in anger, the idea of putting a naval cannon on an airplane was considered madness. Yet, in the desperate years of the Battle of the Atlantic, desperation often drove invention faster than caution could stop it. The de Havilland Mosquito, designed in secret before the war, had been born from that kind of defiance. Made almost entirely of laminated plywood, the Mosquito had originally been intended as an unarmed reconnaissance aircraft, its speed and altitude meant to be its protection. But the war changed it. The same wooden frame that saved metal for Spitfires and bombers also gave engineers a blank slate. They turned it into a night fighter, a bomber, and eventually a submarine killer. The idea came from the Air Ministry's anti-shipping branch, which in 1943 began looking for a way to strike surfaced U-boats before they could dive. Depth charges required accuracy and time. Rockets often splashed wide. A more precise, hard-hitting weapon was needed, something that could crack a submarine open before it vanished beneath the surface. Enter the 57mm Molins cannon, originally designed for British light tanks. The Molins Machine Company had already adapted it for naval gunboats, fitting it with an electric feed that could chamber rounds automatically. An engineer named H.R. Molins himself proposed that, with proper balance and recoil dampening, the weapon could fit into the Mosquito's nose. Most thought it impossible. A cannon weighed nearly 700 pounds, and the ammunition another 300. Mounting it required removing the aircraft's 4.303 Brownings and its entire nose structure. But the Air Ministry approved experimental trials at Boscombe Down in late 1943. Test pilots who took the prototype aloft described it as a beast that kicks. The first live fire test shattered the aircraft's gun mount. The second cracked the windscreen. Engineers eventually fitted a reinforced bulkhead, hydraulic recoil dampers, and 25 rounds in a gravity-fed drum. Each shell was a 6-pound high-explosive projectile capable of punching through 2 inches of armor or a submarine's pressure hull at a bleak angle. The new variant received a curious nickname, Tsetse, after the biting African fly. The analogy fits: small, fast, and lethal. When Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips first saw his assigned Tsetse in the hangar at Prowled, he thought it looked like a hunter missing its spear tip. The nose had been lengthened and reshaped around the cannon's barrel, giving the aircraft a slightly predatory angle. You could feel it was meant to strike downward. He later wrote in his logbook, "Training with the cannon was as dangerous as combat itself. Pilots practiced firing at derelict barges off the Cornish coast, approaching at 250 miles per hour and firing in 2-second bursts. Even short engagements rattled teeth and shook dials loose. Each round left a plume of water and steam where it struck. Gunners joked that the Mosquito no longer shot, it punched holes in the ocean." In one of the few surviving debriefing reports from the Air Force Historical Research Agency, Phillips described the challenge. "The main difficulty is not hitting the target, but keeping the nose down after the shot. The recoil lifts the entire aircraft. You fight it like a wave hitting from below." By early 1944, 248th Squadron had mastered the weapon. From their base in Cornwall, they flew long-range patrols across the Bay of Biscay, paired with standard Mosquito FB.6 carrying rockets. The Tsetse's job was to deliver the killing blow. Ground crews called them the wooden cannon. To the men who flew them, they were something between a fighter and a destroyer, fragile in body, merciless in purpose. On the morning of March 10th, the duty roster pinned to the operations board listed 2 Tsetses for immediate readiness. Phillips' aircraft coded O Orange was first in line. As he climbed aboard, the armorers slid a final round into the drum, a shell with its brass nose polished to a dull gleam. The engines started with their familiar synchronized growl, shaking the hangar doors. The aircraft rolled into the wet light of dawn, its propellers scattering spray from the tarmac. Over the wireless came the voice of the controller. "All right, gentlemen, new contact confirmed. German transmission north of Brest, course west. You'll lead the intercept." Phillips glanced once at the cannon's arming lever, pushed it forward until it clicked, and smiled faintly. "Let's go show them what a wooden airplane can do."
The aircraft lifted off, vanishing into the clouds, the 57mm cannon glinting briefly in the pale morning light, a weapon born from the intersection of fear, ingenuity, and the will to strike back. The Bay of Biscay stretched beneath the Mosquito like a sheet of hammered metal, cold, restless, and deceptive. Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips and his navigator Jack Turner flew low, barely 100 feet above the waves, their twin Marlin engines thundering against the wind. The Tetsey's airframe creaked under the strain, but this is how the Mosquito hunted: fast, silent on radar, and invisible until it was too late. The horizon ahead glowed with the first light of dawn. Behind them, the coast of Cornwall had long since disappeared into mist. The aircraft's onboard ASV Mk.XVIII radar pulsed steadily, its scope sweeping from metallic shapes breaking the sea's surface. Turner watched the green screen, headphones clamped over his ears, his pencil tapping impatiently on the edge of his chart. Contact range 6 miles, bearing 092, look steady.
Phillips eased the control column forward, descending another 50 feet. The Mosquito skimmed the waves now, salt spray streaking across the windscreen. Turner called again. Echo growing stronger. Single large return. Must be a U-boat. Far ahead, U-976 had surfaced moments earlier to ventilate her stale air and recharge her batteries. The previous night's passage at periscope depth had drained the cells nearly to exhaustion. Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Zahn stood on the bridge with his watch officer, scanning the pale morning for signs of aircraft. The wind carried the sharp scent of salt and oil, the familiar rhythm of diesels echoing through the conning tower. "Radio message to Lorient complete, Herr Captain," the radio man reported from below. Zahn nodded. "Keep it short next time. Every second we broadcast is another chance for them to find us." He looked west. The sea was calm, a deceptive peace. For months now, every surfacing had felt like an invitation to death. Reports had circulated among U-boat crews, new Allied aircraft with long-range radar, weapons that could strike from beyond sight. Zahn didn't believe all the rumors, but he trusted experience. When the ocean grew too quiet, danger usually followed. At 07:22 hours, a faint glimmer appeared on the horizon. 2 points of silver light moving fast against the morning haze. Zahn's binoculars froze on the shapes. For a split second, his mind refused to name them. Then, instinct took over. "Flieger alarm! Crash dive!" The alarm bell clanged through the hull. Men dropped tools, scrambled down the ladder, and slammed hatches shut. Zahn shouted orders into the voice tube. "Flood main ballast! Dive to 20 meters! Fast!" But the sea obeyed physics, not desperation. From the first alarm to submersion, even the best crews needed half a minute. Zahn's U-boat had 19 seconds before the Atlantic closed above her. Phillips had already seen the flash of silver wake that betrayed a surfacing submarine. "There she is! 11 o'clock!" he barked. The Mosquito's nose dipped. The 57mm Molins cannon, armed and ready, pointed directly at the diving shape. Turner adjusted the gyro sight. "Range 2,000 yards! Closing fast!" The Mosquito dove from 600 feet, wind screaming past the canopy. Phillips squeezed the trigger. The cannon jolted violently, and the aircraft lurched upward under recoil. A streak of white spray erupted where the shell struck the water, just short of the submarine's bow. He corrected his aim and fired again. The second round struck closer, ricocheting once before disappearing beneath the surface. Turner counted aloud. 3, 4. Each shot shook the plane like a fist striking an anvil. The fourth shell hit home, just as the U-boat's bow began to dip under. The water erupted around the conning tower in a column of steam and debris. Down below, Zahn clung to the periscope handle as the hull shuddered. A deafening crack echoed through the control room, followed by the sickening hiss of seawater bursting through ruptured plating. The lights flickered,
then died. 19 seconds after the alarm bell, the first shell that had skipped across the sea struck beneath the waterline just forward of the conning tower. Phillips banked the Mosquito hard, circling over the growing slick of oil and bubbles. Turner leaned forward, staring out the side window. "She's going under! Fast!" Phillips didn't cheer. He only stared at the widening patch of foam and smoke below. "Mark the position and set course for home." As the Mosquito climbed into the clouds, the ocean beneath them swallowed its victim without a trace. The hunter had found its prey, and 19 seconds decided everything. From the moment Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Zahn shouted "crash dive," the stopwatch of survival began. Second 1, the alarm bell clanged through U-976's narrow steel passageways. Men jolted awake, boots slamming on wet decking. The diesel engine still roared on the surface, throwing exhaust into the cold air. Zahn grabbed the voice tube and barked orders. "Flood forward tanks! Close the upper hatch!" Second 3. Seawater began rushing into the ballast tanks. The boat lurched forward, heavy in the bow. The last lookout jumped down the hatch, slamming the steel lid as the deck disappeared beneath the waves. Inside, condensation ran down the bulkheads like sweat. Second 6. Above, the Mosquito Tetsi screamed out of the morning haze, diving at over 300 miles per hour. Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips locked the illuminated sight on the faint gray oval below, a U-boat caught in motion, half in and half out of its element. "Steady! Firing!" he said. The 57mm Molins cannon thundered. The first shell streaked through the air at 2,900 feet per second, plunging into the sea ahead of the submarine's bow. A geyser of white spray shot upward.
Inside the U-boat, Zahn felt the shock of water hammering the hull. "Keep diving!" he roared. The inclinometer needle slid toward 20 degrees. Crewmen sealed hatches, fingers bleeding from frozen metal. The second round hit. It skipped once across the surface before disappearing beneath the waves, traveling underwater like a torpedo. On the Mosquito's gun camera film, the flashes came faster now. 3, 4, 5. Each shell left the muzzle with a concussive roar that rattled the entire aircraft. Turner, gripping the side of the cockpit, shouted, "Direct hits! Around the tower!" One of those shells struck just after the conning tower. The water muffled the explosion, but the pressure wave slammed against the U-boat's thin steel skin. Rivets sheared. The control room went dark for a heartbeat as circuit breakers tripped. Zahn steadied himself, shouting into the engine room, "Blow main ballast! Schnell!" The air compressors kicked in, but the response was sluggish. The diving planes had jammed from the blast shock. The bow dropped sharply. Above, Phillips held the trigger for a final burst. The Molins autoloader slammed another shell into place. He fired again. The last round hit the waterline, angling downward, striking the hull just below the surface. The explosion that followed tore open a seam near the battery compartment. A geyser of water and oil blasted upward, then vanished into white foam. UA-976's nose pitched violently downward. Lights failed completely. In the forward section, seawater poured through a jagged hole, filling compartments faster than the pumps could react. Zahn knew instantly that they would not reach depth control. He gave one last command. "Seal forward bulkhead! Prepare to surface if we can!" But there was no surface left to reach. The boat rolled to port, a groan of metal echoing through the hull as pressure crushed the outer casing. Above the scene, Phillips banked hard to avoid his own shell spray. "That's it," Turner said, voice tight. "She's breaking up." Through the cockpit glass, they watched the ocean convulse, air bubbles, debris, then a spreading stain of black oil. Phillips eased the throttle and climbed through the mist. "Mark time 0723, he said. Turner scribbled it into his log. "Approximate position 50 miles northwest of Brest." Neither man spoke for several minutes. The Setse droned onward, the cannon still warm, the smell of cordite heavy in the cockpit. Phillips finally exhaled. 19 seconds, he murmured. That's all they had. Hours later, when 248 Squadron reviewed the gun camera footage, the analysts gathered in silence around the flickering projection. Grainy black-and-white frames showed the Mosquito's shadow racing over the ocean, the stuttering flashes of cannon fire, and then, barely visible, a boiling mass of spray where UA-976 had been. The entire sequence lasted less than 20 seconds. But for the engineers and ordnance specialists watching, it was more than just another confirmed strike. It was proof that physics, when paired with precision, could end a submarine's life faster than any depth charge. The 57mm Molins gun, officially designated the QF 6-pounder Mark III, had been modified with a hydraulic recoil system that absorbed each shot's massive force. Each round left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second, its 6-pound shells spinning along a rifled path before it met the sea. On paper, the weapon had a maximum range of 6,000 yards, but against a U-boat, range was meaningless. The real secret lay in the angle of fire. Fired shallow, the shells skipped once across the surface, losing only a fraction of their velocity. On the second contact, the round would pierce the water, continuing its path beneath the surface for a brief but deadly moment before detonation. The Molins shells were fitted with delay fuses, half a second between impact and explosion, designed so that the blast occurred not above the waves, but within them. That difference meant the shock wave transmitted directly into the submarine's hull, magnifying its effect tenfold. British tests at the armament development establishment, Submarines, had demonstrated it months earlier. When fired at submerged steel plates, the shell's underwater overpressure reached nearly 2,000 pounds per square inch within a radius of 3 meters. A hit even near the pressure hull could buckle plates, rupture seals, and jam dive planes. It was, in essence, a direct-fire depth charge. The wreckage analysis teams from Coastal Command Intelligence Section 15 later studied the effects on a recovered U-boat fragment brought up by fishing trawlers weeks after the engagement. The jagged steel bore a clean puncture roughly 7 centimeters wide, the edges curled inward. Metallurgists confirmed that the projectile had entered just below surface, passed through a ballast tank, and exploded inside the battery compartment. The heat had been so intense that fragments were fused with molten lead from the acid batteries. In post-war evaluations, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Pacific Theater Technical Appendix, made note of the Mosquito's cannon effects, describing them as instantaneous and terminal to submarine structure. Even hardened submariners, interviewed after the war, admitted they had no defense against such attacks. One captured Kriegsmarine officer, Oberleutnant zur See Ernst Becker, explained it succinctly during a 1945 interrogation. "We could dive in 30 seconds if the engines were running, but the aircraft appeared at 10, and when it fired, the shells came not from above, but from the sea itself. There was no chance." That sensation of being hunted by something that could strike underwater had spread like rumor through the U-boat fleet by 1944. Crews nicknamed the Mosquito their Holtz toad, the wooden death. They claimed its shells walked across the waves. Naval scientists later found that description was not entirely poetic. The Molins shell's high sectional density and angular velocity allowed for short overwater skips, an unintentional but effective side effect of its velocity and mass. Inside RAF archives, one engineering report summarized the phenomenon in terse understatement. Observed trajectory suggests surface tension-assisted ricochet, capable of secondary impact velocity exceeding 1,500 feet per second. Lethality beyond expectation. For Phillips and Turner, the men who had fired those shells, the technical marvel mattered little. They had not thought of trajectories or terminal pressure. They had only seen a brief glint of steel, a few flashes, and the end of 90 men. But for those who studied the film, the 57mm cannon represented something larger, the evolution of warfare into mathematics, where the line between machine and man blurred into equations of range, fuse delay, and velocity.
The sea looked deceptively peaceful when Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips and Flying Officer Jack Turner turned their Mosquito north for the long flight home. The sun was higher now, bright enough to paint the waves silver. Yet below that brightness lay silence. No oil slick rising, no wreckage visible, just the endless roll of water. Turner marked the coordinates on his chart: 47 degrees north, 6 degrees west. He drew a neat circle and wrote, U-boat probable, time 07:23. Then he folded the chart and stowed it. Neither man spoke for the next hour. The engines hummed, the radio hissed occasionally, and somewhere between the static and the wind, Phillips could still hear the echo of the Molins cannon's recoil reverberating in his chest. When they landed at RAF Pradonic just after 0900 hours, ground crews waved them in with the casual precision of men who had done it hundreds of times. The Tsetsi rolled to a stop, its engines coughing to silence. The smell of burnt cordite lingered. Armorers swarmed the aircraft, checking the cannon recoil mounts and counting the remaining shells. Only 16 of 25 were left. Phillips climbed down first, his boots splashing into a shallow puddle. He looked at the nose of the aircraft. The Molins cannon was streaked with salt and soot, the barrel still warm. For a moment, he thought of the men below the waves, their captain shouting orders, the panic, and the soundless crush of water closing over steel. He brushed his glove across the barrel and muttered quietly, "That'll do." In the intelligence hut, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and the faint scent of coffee gone stale. Squadron Intelligence Officer Flight Lieutenant Douglas Reed was waiting, papers already stacked beside the projector. "Sit down, gentlemen. Let's go through it." Turner spread the chart on the table, pointing to the circled position. Contact at 0719, visual confirmation of U-boat on the surface. Fired 9 rounds, last visible at 0723. Submerged, no reappearance. Reed nodded and adjusted his glasses. Gun camera film. Phillips handed over the reel. Fully recorded, the last 2 shots disappeared into spray. No sign of survivors. For the next 10 minutes, the projector clattered softly, casting black and white ghosts across the wall. The film showed the Mosquito diving, the ocean exploding in flashes, then fading back to stillness. Reed stopped the reel, rewound, and ran it again. "Excellent grouping," he murmured. The angle of approach was textbook. He scribbled in his notes, "Effective cannon employment at 1,200 yards, estimated U-boat destruction, claim 1 probable." "Probable?" Turner asked quietly. Reed looked up. "Until we have debris or survivors, yes. The Air Ministry is strict about confirmations." Phillips exhaled slowly. "They're not confirming much of anything down there."
Reed gave a faint smile, the kind officers learn to wear when the truth is too blunt. "Understood, Tony. Still, excellent work. You and Turner will be cited in the next squadron dispatch." Outside, the Cornish wind howled over the airfield, rattling the hangar doors. Mechanics worked in silence, their movements efficient but subdued. They had seen too many crews return with empty seats, and too many victories that left a quiet ache behind them. That night, Phillips sat on his bunk, writing in his logbook under the dim yellow glow of a single lamp. He recorded the essentials: date, time, altitude, rounds fired, but the notes he added at the bottom weren't regulation. Engaged surfaced U-boat, 19 seconds of fire. No return shots. Unclear if any escaped. Sea calm. Visibility good. Felt heavy afterward. He stared at the page for a long time before closing the book. Across the barracks, someone was laughing softly over a card game. Another pilot strummed a tune on a dented guitar. Life, it seemed, went on between missions. The next morning, the message board carried a new order. 248 Squadron to continue anti-submarine operations. Coastal Command expresses satisfaction with cannon performance. No mention of U-976. No names.
No acknowledgement that 90 men had vanished beneath those coordinates. For Phillips, that was the rhythm of the war. Strike, return, refuel, repeat. But deep down, the image of the boiling sea lingered. He would remember it long after the noise of engines and the smell of oil had faded. 19 seconds of combat. A lifetime of echoes. By May 1943, the Mosquito crews of Coastal Command had rewritten the rules of sea warfare. What began as an experiment, mounting a 57mm anti-tank cannon on a wooden aircraft, was now a growing legend across Allied bases from Cornwall to Iceland. To the Germans, it was something more ominous, an invisible predator that struck from cloud and sunlight alike. U-boat commanders whispered about it in mess halls and on submarine decks. They called it Der Holzgeist, the wooden ghost. Reports filtered in to the Kriegsmarine Command at Lorient, describing attacks that lasted less than half a minute, but left submarines torn open, their hulls ripped apart, not by depth charges or bombs, but by shells that seemed to pierce clean through before exploding from within. In one intercepted message, a German officer lamented, "It is not fair, aircraft with guns larger than destroyers." Inside the engineering hangars of RAF Predenac, the mechanics of 248 Squadron worked through nights of salt wind and fatigue. The Molins gun crews tuned the recoil dampers, reinforced the gun mounts with thicker bolts, and experimented with new armor-piercing rounds tipped for greater penetration. Every Mosquito that taxied out bore the scars of field modification. Extra rivets, hastily patched bullet holes, and the faint smell of resin from freshly repaired wood. The paradox was striking. A warplane built largely from birch and balsa, yet carrying a cannon capable of sinking steel submarines. Wood against steel, Phillips remarked one morning as he watched armorers slide fresh 6-pounder shells into their racks. It shouldn't work, but it does. Turner grinned, rubbing graphite onto his compass ring. Neither should flying if you think about it too much. News of their previous strike had already circulated through command channels. The debriefings from 13th Fighter Command confirmed their engagement, and post-sortie reconnaissance flights over the same coordinates revealed an expanding oil slick, dark, shimmering, and unmistakable. The U-boat, later identified as U-976, had not returned to port. Official records listed her as missing, presumed lost, Bay of Biscay, 18th April 1943. Confirmation came weeks later through Allied intercepts and the interrogation of a captured radio man from another flotilla. He recalled hearing U-976's final transmission. "Under air attack, heavy damage, diving." The line cut abruptly. The confirmation brought no celebration. Only a terse line entered into the squadron diary. Claim upgraded from probable to confirmed. U-976 destroyed by Mosquito FB-10 The crew of 92 lost. For Phillips, the entry carried the weight of those 19 seconds. Each round, each decision compressed in that moment between horizon and sea spray. In June, the squadron commander gathered his men for a short briefing. On the board behind him, chalk lines traced the Bay of Biscay and the new hunting zones. "Gentlemen, the Germans are adapting. They've increased their anti-aircraft armament. Twin 37mm cannons on the bridges, extra lookouts. They'll fight harder." Someone muttered from the back, "Let 'em try." The commander gave a tight smile. "They will. And remember, the Mosquito's strength is surprise. You strike once, and you strike true. Never linger." That afternoon, Phillips walked the length of his aircraft, running a hand along the smooth, varnished skin of the fuselage. It was light, almost fragile to the touch. But beneath the paint lay strength, the kind born from precision and daring design. The Mosquito had no armor, no self-sealing tanks, and yet it survived because it was faster than fear itself. He looked up at the sky, bright, clean, and cold. Somewhere beyond that horizon, more U-boats were waiting, surfacing for air and arrogance,
and somewhere, another wooden ghost would be waiting for them. That night, as the last light faded over the Cornish cliffs, the airfield hummed with engines being tested, tools clinking, and radio chatter whispering across static. The war had become a rhythm, a duel of inventions, where every improvement drew blood. Wood against steel. Speed against armor. And for those who flew the Mosquito, 19 seconds was all the difference between hunter and hunted. In the years that followed, the world moved on from the sound of war. The Bay of Biscay returned to its quiet rhythm, tides rolling over wrecks, salt erasing paint, and fish swimming through twisted steel that once bore the flag of the Kriegsmarine. Beneath those waters lay hundreds of graves, including that of U-976, struck down in 19 seconds by a wooden aircraft with a cannon the size of a field gun. For decades, the story lingered only in logbooks and fragmentary reports. The men of 248 Squadron went home, their missions buried beneath the broader victories of D-Day and Berlin. The Mosquito, once called the Wooden Wonder, became a museum relic, its skin of birch and balsa varnished to a soft sheen. Visitors admired its beauty without knowing the violence it had once unleashed over the Atlantic. Flight Lieutenant Tony Phillips survived the war. He returned to Cornwall and took up work as a carpenter, a quiet irony not lost on him. In the smell of sawdust and varnish, he sometimes caught a memory, the crack of the Molins cannon, the recoil through the fuselage, the flash of white water where a submarine's hull gave way. He rarely spoke of it. When asked, he'd only say, "It happened fast, too fast to think." It wasn't until the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, when the Allies began to compile a definitive record of wartime operations, that the full story of Operation Vengeance's European counterpart, the Mosquito's anti-submarine campaign, was revisited. The transcripts of 13th Fighter Command debriefings, the U.S. Naval Historical Archives, and the Kriegsmarine's captured logs painted a picture of precision and terror, the duel of seconds where technology and human nerve collided. In one of those declassified reports, an interrogation transcript from 1946, a surviving U-boat officer described the attack on U-976. His words were stark. "We surfaced for battery charge. It was calm. Suddenly, the lookout shouted. 2 aircraft very fast, no sound until they were almost on us. We manned the flak gun, but before we could fire, there were explosions. The deck was gone. I remember water, steam, then darkness." For historians, that 19-second encounter became a case study in the intersection of engineering and instinct. The Mosquito FB Mk.XVIII, codenamed Tsitsi, represented the ultimate evolution of tactical air power, fast enough to evade, armed enough to destroy, yet fragile enough to demand perfection from its crew. In 1985, at the Pacific and Atlantic Veterans Reunion in Honolulu, Phillips met a handful of surviving Mosquito pilots. Their hair was gray, their hands trembled when they held coffee cups instead of control columns. Yet when they spoke, their voices carried the old cadence of airmen, precise, calm, matter-of-fact. One of them, a Canadian named Harold Jameson, raised a toast that silenced the room. He said, "To the ones who went below, and to the 19 seconds that decided it." Phillips lifted his glass but didn't drink. He was thinking of the sea again, the way it had swallowed everything so quickly, leaving behind only silence. In 2008, marine archaeologists from France discovered the wreck of U-976 off the coast of Brittany. It lay at a depth of nearly 240 feet, the hull split open just forward of the conning tower, consistent with a direct hit from a 57mm armor-piercing shell. Inside, they found no remains, only corroded tools,
shattered dials, and the ghostly shape of a periscope still pointing upward. When the report reached the Royal Air Force Museum, an archivist wrote a simple notation beside 248 Squadron's combat log. Confirmed. Target location matches Mosquito attack, April 18, 1943. That was all the closure history could offer. For Phillips, by then long gone, it didn't matter. What remained was not pride or vengeance, but a lesson carved into memory. That even in a world of iron and fire, it was imagination and courage that tipped the scales. A wooden aircraft had brought down a steel leviathan, not through strength, but through daring. And somewhere beneath the waves of the Bay of Biscay, the echoes of those 19 seconds still lingered, timeless, weightless, a reminder that war's most fleeting moments can outlast the men who lived them.